all here. Let's get going. So thanks everyone for joining today. We're really happy to have you here and we're looking forward to the conversation. So today's topic, new president, new pay equity and reporting requirements. It's a question. What you're going to find out today is what we think and what this panel of experts thinks is on the horizon as it relates to disclosures, legislation, state, federal, everything that you need to know as you move forward trying to plan what the next couple of years have in store. So let's get started. A couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, I'll introduce myself and then I'll introduce the panelists in just a second. My name is Maria Colacurcio and I'm the CEO at Syndio. So before we kick off, just a few things that you see on this slide here. So first of all, legal advice disclaimer. It sounds like we're giving legal advice, but we're actually not. So the information we're providing today is not intended to be actual legal advice. Though both Sarah and Christine are lawyers, they're not your lawyers. So there's a difference there. So just take the information as informational only, good information to have, but not specifically legal advice. There is a live transcript that you can enable. You just have to turn on the closed captioning setting, which is at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. For privacy purposes, we're not turning on, obviously, attendees' audio and video. That's disabled, so it's just us, but you can ask questions. And I, as the moderator, would love it if you did that, utilizing the Q&A feature below, and I'll try to get your questions. I'm going to try to sprinkle a few throughout, and then we'll set time aside at the end to get to more of your questions. So do please use that feature often. The webinar is being recorded, so afterwards we'll send you a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides. So don't worry about trying to jot everything down. We love note takers if that's the way that you learn, but you will get a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. We will do a survey at the end and we love to have your feedback. So please let us know. Just take that extra 1 minute to fill out the survey at the end so that we know how we did and whether you found this information useful. Okay, so our speakers today. If I do this well, you're going to hear a lot less from me and a lot more from the two experts that you see pictured here. So Christine Hendrickson is the VP of Strategic Initiatives at Syndio. I've had the pleasure of working with Christine for the past couple of years. She has 15 plus, really 2 decades of experience in employment law, and she's been working at the intersection of HR analytics and law. She partners with employers, our customers, and others. And she does this in a way that's really interesting because it takes into account her background in legal, but also sprinkles in what she's been learning around the HR analytics and compensation side. So she's working with our customers to provide strategic, practical, cutting edge, real world best practice advice on everything from pay equity to diversity, inclusion, everything that has metrics associated with it. Before joining Syndio, Christine was a partner and co-chair of the pay equity group at Seyfarth Shaw. Then we've got Sarah Wieselthier. We're super, super happy to have Sarah with us today. So Sarah, thanks for being here and stepping in. Sarah is a partner at Phillips. She's a very, very highly respected employment lawyer with extensive experience counseling some of the most really high profile companies that we won't name here, but on compliance issues. And she's been a frequent speaker on breaking legal updates involving pay equity and wage and hour issues. So we really appreciate, Sarah, you stepping in and being here with us today. Okay, so on to the next. This is what we're going to be talking about today. And again, Keith Sonderling was supposed to be with us, but due to some media speculation around a labor position, he wasn't able to join, but we will be featuring him in an upcoming webinar in a couple months from now, probably January. So the outline for the agenda today, we're going to discuss the current state of pay equity, federal, state, international. We have some predictions for you. And then, of course, we will get to that Q&A. So quick who we are, just in terms of who is Syndio, why are we convening this audience, why are we bringing folks together to talk about this? We are a platform. We're the #1 pay equity solution, and we work with a whole bunch of companies. We really analyze at this point almost 10 million employees across about 350 companies, and you can see a smattering of those logos here. What differentiates us is that we have this mix of sophisticated technology solutions and expert advice, and our support spans everything from legal best practices, custom statistical analyses, reporting, and communications. So everything you're about to hear today about the landscape, legislation, compliance, disclosures, where it's going. This is our bread and butter. This is what we do every single day. Okay, Sarah, I would love for you to take this opportunity to introduce Fisher Phillips to folks who may not know about what you all do.
Thanks so much, Maria. So Fisher Phillips is a national labor and employment law firm. And relevant to our discussion today, we work really hard to stay on top of legal developments and are committed to helping employers navigate the complexities of pay equity and all of these compliance issues. So one of the newest resources that we have, I think it may have come off your screen if you go back to the slide. But one of the newest resources that we have available on our website is a post-election resource center, where we are throwing tons of thought leadership as to what we're predicting, what we think we'll be seeing under the next Trump administration when it comes to a whole host of employment issues. We also have a dedicated pay equity practice group, of which I am a founding member, where we really devote our time to tackling a lot of the same issues that Syndio does: pay equity compliance, equal pay audits, all of those, all the legal landscape that we need to keep on top of. If you see the link there, we actually maintain a map that has all of the state-specific information on, pay transparency law, salary history plans, everything you need to know about pay equity compliance in all 50 states. And we also have a dedicated wage and hour practice group, which is linked on your slide, which also focuses on, various pay practices, worker classification analyses, and steps that are critical to determining compliance with federal and state wage and hour laws. And on that page, we also have some helpful 50 state maps, which have key information on, what the minimum wage is, places where you need to give notice before pay changes, and all of the pertinent things you need to know to be in compliance with federal and state wage and hour laws.
We are so lucky to get to work with the team at Fisher Phillips in a partnership, and that all of their resources are great. So definitely, I really strongly encourage everyone to look at them because they're really, really excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, let's dive in. So Christine, the first big question is going to head over to you. So by my count, there's basically 4 big players in the space, and I'm hoping that you can break this down for us and our audience a little bit more. There's the EEOC, you've got the OFCCP, states, and then you've got this global cross-pollination. So can you give us a lay of the land? Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the federal level, as you said, there's really 2 key players that enforce equal pay laws. The first one is the EEOC. The EEOC was opened its doors in 1965 when the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Title VII, passed. And they are the kind of soup to nuts enforcer of a lot of the equal pay laws. So think of Title VII, the Equal Pay Act, but also some of the laws that have kind of compensation components, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Age Discrimination Act. They also enforce GINA. They are responsible, they're the kind of key civil rights enforcement agency at the federal level. All employers, or at least most employers that have at least 15 employees, are covered by laws that impact the EEOC. The Equal Pay Act covers virtually all employers, actually, but most of the laws kick in at 20 or more. At 20 or more, and they're your kind of primary civil rights enforcement agency at the federal level. Then there's this kind of other agency called the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or the OFCCP. And the OFCCP regulates non-discrimination and affirmative action for employers that do business with the federal government. So anyone who provides goods or services to the government, so if you are someone who is filling the machines in a federal building, or if you are a if you're a hotel and you're holding banquets that the federal government is using, or if you're providing the nuts that go on tires that ultimately are part of cars that are used by the federal government, all of those, both those direct contracts and then those subcontracts, are subject to the obligations of the OFCCP. And the OFCCP is a little bit different than the EEOC in not only just because they only are focused on federal contractors, but they also do routine and regular audits. So instead of having someone have to file a charge saying that they believe they've been discriminated against, the OFCCP, and although the EEOC can do this in some ways, but the OFCCP much more routinely can do these routine investigations to ensure that employers are aligned with their affirmative action and non-discrimination obligations. So a lot happens in those two federal agencies. But a lot happens actually at the state level. So in addition to the federal agencies, every state in the US, this is kind of new news as of a couple of years ago when Mississippi turned the page, have some law that impacts equal pay. And so the states are the ones that are enforcing those laws, and they have their own civil rights agencies that are enforcing those laws at the state level. And that is not and so there's a lot going on at the state level. And then increasingly so, we're seeing a lot of global cross-pollination. So many of our customers, most of our Syndio customers, I'm sure most of the folks that Sarah works with are global employers that they have, or at least multinational employers that have employees that sit not just in the US, but all around the globe. And so the laws that impact all of those, of course, impact this pay equity space. So for employers, they're really navigating, what's the OFCCP doing? What's the EEOC doing? What are the states doing? And then also looking at their global lens in addition to that as well.
Thanks, Christine. So let's take a minute and dive a little bit more into the EEOC, because this is a bipartisan commission. And I think that's something that not a lot of people are aware of, at least at first glance. Can you talk us through the composition of this group and what that really means? Of course, we've got Keith, who is open. And again, we dropped an article in the chat so that you could see why he wasn't here today. He was very, very much wanted us to send his apologies. But Christine, can you kind of walk through what is the EEOC? How's it structured? You just gave us a really good overview of what they're focused on, but talk to us about this composition.
Yeah, absolutely. So the EEOC is a bipartisan commission. There are five presidentially appointed members. So there's a chair, a vice chair, and 3 commissioners. Imagine this with like a 5-person crew. So right now there are 3 Democrats, 1 Republican, and an empty seat. These are rolling 5-year appointments, and the president doesn't have the power to remove any members until they complete their term, except for, in very rare instances. So right now, the commission that we have is, as you'll see on this page, is the commission that we're going to have at least until 2026, when Jocelyn Samuels, who's currently the vice chair, ends her term. It is very likely that one of the very first things that President Trump will do is to make Andrea Lucas, who's the only Republican that's currently sitting on the EEOC, the chair. So that's something he can do without changing the composition of who's there. But we really wanted to just explain kind of how this works. And I wanted to tell you like 3 things that cannot change, or at least are very unlikely to change, barring some kind of massive change, which we're not anticipating in any way. At least until July of 2026, when Jocelyn Samuels' term ends. So at least until July of 2026, we're likely going to have Andrea Lucas as the chair. It's likely that President Trump will appoint a new commissioner to take the place in that vacant role that's held by Keith Sonderling. So that means that we'll have 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats in seat until 2026. there's a lot that this bipartisan commission controls within the EEOC. And as I mentioned, the EEOC is the primary regulatory enforcement agency. So what can't they do? What can't the commission, what if Andrea Lucas becomes the chair of the EEOC? What can she do and what can't she do? So I thought I'd start with the things that she can't do. So the first thing she can't do is she can't revoke formal guidance from the EEOC. So for example, the EEOC issued rules implementing the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. They also have enforcement guidance around harassment that was put out. And unless there's a majority, if Andrea Lucas is acting chair of the EEOC or chair of the EEOC, she won't be able to modify that guidance because it requires a majority vote. And right now we'll still have 3 Democrats, Charlotte Burrows, Jocelyn Samuels, and Cabana on in seat, and because of the 3 of them, unless they are voting in a more bipartisan way, it's unlikely that any of that will be changed. So again, they cannot revoke formal guidance from unless there's a majority. They're also not able to modify the EEOC's current strategic plan or its strategic enforcement plan. So every few years, the EEOC puts out a plan that outlines, these are the things that we're going to focus on as an agency. And that has impacts because it impacts what all of the individual line staff within the EEOC, what they're kind of most focused on. So if you think of it as your KPIs within a business, the strategic plan or the strategic enforcement plan are kind of like the KPIs for the EEOC. And those cannot be changed until there's a new majority. So the current EEOC strategic enforcement plan runs from 2024 through 2028. And one of the core pieces of the strategic enforcement plan is that they're going to be very laser focused on advancing equal pay for all workers. So employers should expect that those same enforcement efforts will continue, and that we should expect that the EEOC will continue to devote extra resources to investigating and potentially even developing litigation on equal pay issues. That cannot change. So they can't revoke guidance. They can't change the enforcement plan. The other thing that they have limited ability to do, the Trump administration will have limited availability to do, is to change the direction of investigations. So initiating investigations and influencing their outcomes is, there are many, many players and many, many steps within that. And it's likely that they'll be able to make any major modifications if Andrea Lucas becomes, as we're anticipating, the chair of the EEOC until at least Jocelyn Samuels steps down from her current role, or is replaced from her current, when her term ends in 2026. That those things will not change. But there are some things that can change, and we wanted to mention those as well. So what can we expect from the EEOC with this composition? First, they can issue sub-regulatory guidance. So they can issue things like technical assistance. So employers that are really kind of on top of the AI guidance that we've seen from the Biden administration, that's an example of the kind of thing that they can issue. So they can issue sub-regulatory guidance, but they can't issue the formal guidance. If she is chair, as we anticipate, she will also have budget control. So things like where budget is assigned, that is something that the Trump administration would be able to influence, but not able to change the things we already talked about. The other two things I wanted to mention really briefly is that they can prevent bringing what they consider to be any kind of controversial litigation. So if there was any litigation on an issue that there was not agreement, that's something that that they would be able to influence. And then, of course, she can informally influence the direction of the EEOC. So Commissioner Lucas in the past has raised some concerns about the legality of certain DE&I programs under Title VII. She also signed 3 different commissioners' charges against employers who provided abortion travel benefits. So it's not to suggest that there aren't any things that she can do, but we just wanted to show or just provide the information around kind of what they can do and what they can't do. And there's a lot of things that we're likely to see as kind of continued or status quo. So bottom line, definitely expect some changes at the top. Very likely one of the nearer term things that the Trump administration will do once they come into office is make Andrea Lucas the chair of the EEOC. But don't anticipate a sudden U-turn into what the EEOC is doing. It's more like a gradual lane change over the next few years.
Thanks, Christine. I mean, what I heard broadly is equal pay is still a thing, and it's going to continue to be a thing.
Yeah,
And we're not going to see any meaningful changes, at least until 2026. There's a great audience question that I want to pose to the two of you, but first I want to get through this we'll do a speed round through these next 3 slides, because I think it's pretty interesting to see the consistency of resolutions, charges, and settlements across both the EEOC and OFCCP, in addition to some of the dollar resolution and relief numbers, regardless of administration. So Christine, do you want to quickly walk us through these just to get the point across that this doesn't change much based on who's in office at the federal level?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to orient us to this chart, the kind of pink or red stripe in the middle is where the last Trump administration was in office, and the blue was when there was a Democrat in office. And you'll see that the number of charges that are filed actually went up a little bit during the last Trump administration. But we see pretty consistent amounts of charges and resolutions and settlements, administration to administration. And that's because all of the things that we just talked about, which is there's a lot, because we're talking about a bipartisan commission and these things move slowly, we're going to see likely a pretty consistent path. I wouldn't expect kind of massive changes to what we're seeing in terms of charges, resolutions, and settlements. And then on the next slide, that's also true of what we're seeing at the EEOC or at the OFCCP. So within the OFCCP, again, it's that lighter pink is the last Trump administration, and then into the Biden administration. And we actually saw more pay discrimination resolutions that happened during the last Trump administration than we saw during the Biden administration. Now, some of this is, it takes a long time to move these things forward. And so something that may have started at one administration gets finished in another administration. And so that's part of the reason that we see this decline. But again, it's not totally the case that these things change very much administration to administration. And that's certainly also true on the next slide, which is the monetary benefits in claims. So this shows on the Equal Pay Act, the Equal Pay Act resolutions. Again, that light pink are the Republican administration, the blue are the Democratic administration. The first chart shows the amount that the EEOC collected in millions from Equal Pay Act claims, and then the OFCCP's monetary relief in the last Trump administration, and then through the Biden administration. And you'll see that the pattern is not clear. So I would expect that we're going to see some change at the policy level, But the underlying numbers of what charges the OFCCP is getting, which cases are resolving in issues, those charges and outcomes are largely not impacted by the election. And so that's the lay of the land at the federal level.
Awesome. Thanks, Christine. So we're going to move to Sarah and start talking about states in a second, but I did want to pause because there's a couple of audience questions on the EOC, and I think it'd be great to just gather those and get some answers here just for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to move to the state level, Sarah, and you'll be up to share with us some insights on that. So I thought this was an interesting question. I'm really curious to hear what either of you or both of you think of this. So the question is, based on the recent SCOTUS ruling limiting authority of federal agencies, can we expect formal guidance from the EOC to be litigated heavily over the next 4 years? Either of you have a thought on that at all?
You want to take that, Sarah?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I think we're seeing that come up with, anything and everything. I mean, just last week we had the new overtime rules being questioned in the courts. So I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see some challenges to EOC guidance and really all agency guidance over the next, presidential term. What about you, Christine?
Yeah, I think the same. I think the same.
And the second question, and Christine, I've heard you talk about this a bunch of times, and actually I'm at HRPA today, and they were talking about it earlier this morning on one of the panels. The question is, can you speak to what you expect to happen with the EOC's slated plans to revisit gathering wage disclosures as a required field in EO1 reports?
Yeah, the wage disclosure I think is a big one. And it's one of the things that we're going to talk about in our federal predictions. But maybe you want to take that, Sarah, now in terms of what you expect from the federal pay data collection.
Sure. So, as I'm sure most people know, that was something that, the Obama administration was kind of put the new reporting requirements in place. Trump administration shot it down. The Biden administration was then, committed to, or at the beginning of the administration committed to putting them forward, but really it hasn't gained much traction. And we don't anticipate that, the next Trump administration will really differ from what we saw 4 years ago. I imagine that the pay data reporting requirements will not change at the federal level, but as we'll dig into, I think there may be some changes at the state level. There are certain states like California, Illinois that already have specific additional pay data reporting requirements. And we, anticipate that in light of there not being any changes at the federal level, some of these states, especially the ones with the more robust pay equity laws already in place, may enact some of these pay data reporting laws. So we might see it at the state level, but I think it might not really get anywhere on the federal level while we're in another Trump administration.
Yeah, and then and to just echo what Sarah said, at the very end of or just a couple of months ago, Biden suggested that they were going to kind of reinstate the component to the pay data collection at the federal level, but they had planned, they had put as a kind of tentative date January of 2025 when the next step would take. But because of the nuances of this really complicated law called the Paperwork Reduction Act, it basically says to meet the deadline set by the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Democratic majority, so the Biden administration, would have had to have published the first Federal Register notice by August of this year in order to get it through and enacted this year. Because that didn't happen, it means that it's not going to move forward. So it's not one of those things like we saw at the end of the Obama administration where they snuck it just under the line that was ultimately pulled back by the first Trump administration. Here, they're not even going to get it over the line. So we're not even going to see it coming back in that way.
Okay, Sarah, we're going to move to states. I would love for you to give us the lay of the land at what's happening on the state level. I think with pay transparency, salary range transparency, we really saw a fast and furious acceleration across the states. And now it's much higher than 1/3 of all employees are covered by some sort of pay transparency rules in the US. All the states are kind of coming out with their different flavor and take on this. Can you walk us through what you're seeing and what you expect to see coming out of states?
Of course. So pay transparency is definitely the latest trend. Where I'm sitting right now in New Jersey, the governor just on Monday signed a pay transparency law that goes into effect, June 1st of 2025. We're seeing, I think, at my count, as of, this week, there's 14 states plus Washington, D.C., and a handful of municipalities that all have pay transparency laws on the books that are currently in effect or going to have an effective date at some point in the first half of 2025. So for those who don't know what we're talking about, taking a step back, pay transparency is the employer practice of disclosing information about employee compensation to others, either internally or externally or both. And a lot of these laws that we've seen over the last couple of years are requiring employers to disclose a wage or a wage range to prospective candidates or employees on job postings. And the common thread among these state laws is basically that when you have a job post, it needs to include a realistic wage or wage range for that role. And ideally, you're going to whatever candidate you hire will be paid within that range. For the most part, the laws are requiring this to be in a formal job posting, but not all of the state laws require that. Sometimes the law may say only after an interview or only if it's requested. There are also states that require that benefits information must also be included, not just the salary range. Now, there's no requirement for employers to create job postings where one wouldn't have existed previously, but if there's a job post, it must include this information. And multi-state employers should really take note. Employers who have remote positions should take note, because certain state laws may actually expand beyond just, that specific state when it comes to remote workers or potential remote workers located in another state, like Washington, for example. You may have some compliance issues there. As we mentioned earlier, the pay reporting is something that we're also seeing, given what the likely fate is of component 2 on the EO1 forms. We anticipate that there may be additional states that enact their own state-specific laws requiring some of this additional demographic and wage data reporting, like California and Illinois have, like I mentioned before. That would mean disclosing information maybe about the race, ethnicity, gender, or sex of your employees, in addition to the other wage data that is typically provided on an EEO1 form. Many states also have laws prohibiting inquiries into salary history. So the idea behind this is that we shouldn't perpetuate discrimination in pay that may have occurred in the past by, using prior salary as a factor in determining what the pay should be currently. Pay should be based on the responsibilities, the qualifications of the position, maybe some the education or the experience the person brings to the table can be considered, but what someone earned at another job shouldn't be part of the calculus. So, there are many states now that prohibit specifically asking questions about salary history during the interview process on job applications. You want to make sure that your job application doesn't have that column. Oftentimes there's applications where it will say, list the dates of employment, the name of the employer, and then the next column will be what your pay was. Make sure you take that off. That is unlawful in many states. You also, even if a specific state doesn't prohibit that type of inquiry, you want to tread lightly, because you don't want to have any pay equity discrimination type claims, coming up as a result of those questions. One thing to keep in mind is that you can ask questions about salary expectations. That is a permissible question, and that does not violate the salary history laws. And then, just stronger pay equity laws in general. As Christine mentioned, nearly every state in the country has some form of pay equity legislation on the books. The Federal Equal Pay Act only looks at whether there's a pay discrepancy on the basis of gender. And I believe it was California being the first state to expand its pay equity laws to cover protected categories beyond gender. And from there, several states followed suit. So numerous states have state-specific pay equity laws that include other protected categories. Often it's, race or ethnicity. But where I practiced in New York and New Jersey, the pay equity laws actually cover all protected categories that are recognized under the state's anti-discrimination statutes. So the scope of the pay equity laws is much greater. They also often have carve-outs or that are different from the federal law. So the federal law has, specific reasons or category reasons for why pay can be there can be a discrepancy in pay, a legitimate lawful reason, and a lot of the state laws have narrowed those reasons as compared to the federal law. So it's a lot, especially if you're a multi-state employer, to keep up with all the things that are going on. So I really encourage you to go to our Fisher Phillips pay equity map that was linked at the top of the presentation, where we just kind of have a good resource to keep your pulse on all of the different requirements. While we have some insight, into what the Trump administration will look like given his past term in office, whether Trump or Harris was elected didn't really impact the pay equity compliance requirements we're seeing, because the states have really taken the forefront in this. And if we go to the next slide,
Yeah, and Sarah, I'm
yeah.
curious, do you have thoughts on, so obviously you're talking right now about how there's a lot of things changing at the state level and it's not really being impacted by the administration, but I'm curious, do you have any thoughts or insights as to what California, for example, is going to do from here, or any thoughts on California, New York, Colorado, some of the early movers and shakers in the salary transparency or salary range transparency? I'd be interested to hear either of you just kind of wax poetic about what you think they might do next.
Yeah, I think that some of the states that haven't done the pay data reporting, that have more robust pay equity laws, may certainly start to follow California in that regard. And I think just more generally, we're seeing, especially in states with, Democratic legislatures, just, more and more expansion. So, more protected categories being covered, more, enhanced penalties and fines for noncompliance, private rights of action. So I think that's where I anticipate more growth to be in those state laws.
And then I think, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, but I think that we're going to see, in addition to more pay reporting, more focus on opportunity transparency, and maybe even the right to information that we see that we're seeing in the EU.
Got it. Okay, great. Well, let's walk through a quick timeline of federal and state laws, just so that we can get context as to where we've been, to have a better sense of where we are and where we're going.
Sure. So, there's definitely a balance that we see shifting among when the federal government is more active or the state legislatures are more active, and it kind of shifts, right? We'll see that, when the federal government is more active, the states are quiet, and then it sort of flip-flops. And, I think now where we are with the Trump administration coming in and with the states are more active, we're definitely seeing a skew towards more state laws. But you'll see here is a really great timeline, which shows, where we started from at the beginning. So it was really back in the 1940s that, the federal government had some equal pay policies. The Equal Pay Act was introduced but didn't pass. But then you had, on the state level, 9 states passing early equal pay legislation. And then, kind of going through the decades, in the 1960s and the 1970s was really a big boom when it comes to pay equity laws, really driven by the civil rights movement. We see the Equal Pay Act, the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, the EOC is established, the OFCCP is created, you have the ADEA, and you also have another 24 states adopting equal pay laws. And those laws range, a lot of them are at that time were similar to the Equal Pay Act, but I think it was very interesting to see how much activity there was during this time. And then it sort of shifts, the balance shifts, and we have, in the 90s, And in the, early 2000s under the Obama administration, we see the federal government really, taking the reins here. We have, the Obama administration undertaking the Lilly-led Fair Pay Act and also introducing that EEO-1 component too. And then less state action. And if we can go to the next slide, kind of bringing us to the Trump administration, now you see a shift. The Trump administration, put an end to component 2 and the additional pay data reporting requirements. And that's when you really see the state laws really skyrocket. That's when you have California, New York, and Massachusetts in 2016 enacting very robust pay equity laws that really set the trend in motion for other states to follow suit. We had the wave of the salary history bans, started to have some pay transparency laws, some additional states adopting their own equal pay laws. And, other than the Biden administration, announcing that they were going to look to reinstate component 2 and it not really getting off the ground, the federal government's been quiet, and we've seen a continued, swell of the pay data reporting laws, the pay transparency laws. Mississippi became the 50th state to have an equal pay law. So, it seems that we're now in the trend where the states have kind of taken the reins of, enacting equal pay legislation and requirements. And I don't really see that trend changing, at least over the next few years while we have the Trump administration in office.
Thanks, Sarah. So let's expand the aperture and start thinking about what this looks like globally. The EU directive on pay transparency is a hot topic, and I think in particular how some of the interpretations of the directive are starting to impact states over here. So Christine, can you talk us through how really what's happening on a global level, how that's coming to the US and how we're having this cross-pollination of influence?
Yeah, absolutely. When Sarah went through the timeline, it's really striking to me that what's happening in the EU is by far the most significant piece of pay equity legislation that's passed anywhere around the globe since the 1960s, when we saw the action with the Equal Pay Act and Title VII, and the other action that was happening at the state and federal level. We've not seen anything of the scope or scale that we see with the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And what we really find with the EU directive is that there are many things that have been part of the law in the US that we see as a home in the equal pay laws, but many things that are not yet the law in the US that are part of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And I think that this shows a little bit of what we mean. So in the US, we have those stronger pay equity laws. We have more lawsuits. We have salary history bans and pay scale transparency, as Sarah outlined. We're also beginning to see more laws that require opportunity transparency. So laws like we see in Colorado that say you have to share information about who was promoted and you have to post job postings. We just saw that in the New Jersey law that was just passed, that will require posting many promotional opportunities. Illinois has a similar law. But there are a lot of things that are not yet the case in the US. So we don't have any laws in the US that require public pay gap reporting. So as Sarah indicated, we have Illinois and California that require some kind of pay reporting. Massachusetts is a weird one because it would have required pay reporting if we reinstated pay reporting at the federal level. But as Sarah indicated, that's unlikely to happen. And so because that's not likely to happen, it's really just Illinois and California, and neither of those are public. The EU Pay Transparency Directive, the pay gap reporting is very public. It requires mandatory closing of pay gaps. It makes us look at not just equal pay for equal work, but equal pay for work of equal value. And we have things like the right to information. And I really think that these things that are at the bottom of the list, the ones that are in purple, feel like a bit of the roadmap for where I think that the states may go as we continue in the Trump administration, as Sarah, if we go as Sarah has indicated, and I totally agree with you, Sarah, that as we're seeing less at the federal level, we're likely to see more at the state level.
Thanks, Christine. Just a reminder to folks, drop your questions in the chat because we will get to Q&A, or we'll just give you the gift of time if we don't have any questions. But I want to move to the last portion, which is predictions. So Sarah, you covered states earlier, Christine covered federal, so I want to swap and give you an opportunity to tell us first, give us some of your predictions as to what's going to happen at the federal level.
Sure. So I won't go belabor the point, but I think the federal pay data collection is really unlikely for the reasons that we shared. And my other thought on the federal when it comes to wages is that I don't think we're going to really see an increase in the federal minimum wage. Right now the minimum wage at the federal level is $7.25 an hour. It's been that since 2009. The Trump's platform during the campaign did touch upon raising wages. So the way he presented was not as hostile as it was during his earlier administration in terms of not having increases to the minimum wage rate. So there may be a push for a slight increase in the federal minimum wage. I wouldn't anticipate seeing anything where the $15 per hour that, Vice President Harris was campaigning on and that some states have enacted, but, maybe a slight increase in the federal minimum wage, which is long overdue and might come to fruition over the next 4 years.
Thanks, Sarah. Christine, anyone to add on the federal side?
I think the one I'd really point out, I mean, I think that there's going to be more scrutiny on workplace DE&I programs, but I think that the one that's interesting to me is that I think artificial intelligence is going to be given more free rein. Based on the 2022 Republican midterm agenda, they were really emphasizing deregulation and fostering innovation. And I think that as we're seeing leaders like Elon Musk have a very high profile role within the Trump administration, what is likely to be the Trump likely to have a very prominent role in the Trump administration. I think that that's going to really leave a mark on shaping these policies and allow employers to further use technology without as much scrutiny at the federal level.
Thanks. Okay, let's move on to states. Christine, we will start with you.
Perfect.
It looks like there's something going on with the slide.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's start with you, Christine.
Yeah, I think that where I would expect that what is happening in the EU directive is very much the roadmap. So if we look at this, more transparency, more reporting, which Sarah's going to talk about, but I would really focus on opportunity transparency. So opportunity transparency, I think that we're going to continue to see, as we just saw in New Jersey with the passage of a salary history ban, a pay scale disclosure law, and a law in the same law that requires that employers share information and post jobs. I think that we're going to continue to see that as something that we're going to see. That's also the right to information. Michigan right now is considering a law that would require that employers share the wages of peers, average pay of men and average pay of women in the same peer group. A little different, but quite similar to what we see in the right to information in the EU. So I have my eyes firmly on HB 4406 in Michigan. There's a Democrat, the Democrats control House, Senate, and the governor in Michigan. There's an enormous omnibus pay equity bill. This is one piece of that omnibus pay equity bill. And I would focus on that, because if the right to information catches on, it seems like a new trend that we've not seen at the state level. And I think because we're seeing it at the international level, and because I really believe that the EU pay transparency is going to be the roadmap, that's what I'd keep my eye on. So opportunity, career progression, transparency, and the right to information.
Thanks, Christine. Sarah, any thoughts? Any more thoughts on states where this is going? You gave us a lot earlier.
Yeah, again, I don't think pay transparency or pay data reporting is going anywhere. And I think that's why it is so critical for all companies to really be looking at their pay practices because it's all going to become public or at least, shared with the government. So you want to make sure that you are, really taking a closer look at, what you are like, getting or looking at the people who are performing substantially similar work, grouping them together and examining what their pay is. I saw something come up in the chat about, if it's stock options or equity was something that needs to be considered. The answer is yes. When these equal pay laws, you're looking at all the total compensation. It's not just base salary, the bonuses. I mean, if someone is getting, travel or entertainment comp or certain other perks, 401ks, whatever it is, you're really looking at the total compensation. So you want to be mindful of that. It's not just base salary that we're talking about. So you really want to look at the people who are performing substantially similar work, and they might be in different departments, they may be in different locations, but you want to really examine how they're being paid and figure out if there's any, discrepancies in the pay, figure out whether those can be explained by lawful factors, and if not, take steps to correct it. Because, once you start putting the salary ranges on job posts, your current employees are going to see that too, and they might have some questions about what they're getting paid. And if you have to share that information and report it to the government and there's any red flags or discrepancies, you want to be prepared with the documentation and information to defend your pay practices. So it's really important to take a look at what you're doing, conduct a pay audit, really get ahead of any issues that may exist, because the transparency, the opportunity transparency, it's not going anywhere. It's only going to become more public, this information. You need to prepare yourselves for that.
Thanks, Sarah. So you grabbed one question in the chat. So a couple of more. I'll throw this one out to you, Christine. It says, our team in Germany has low confidence that the EU will be translated into German law and implemented in Germany in the next 5 years. How quickly do you think the EU directive will be fully implemented in EU countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're hearing that it's kind of moving. The directive requires that employers report out in by June 2027 based on 2026 data. And I'm not seeing that. I'm not hearing anything that would suggest that date is not moving. It is going to move. And in fact, we've already seen a draft out of Sweden. And we're seeing out of at least a portion of Belgium. And so I haven't heard anything that would suggest that data is moving.
Thanks, Christine. Another question, does the EU directive require employers to share information related to total rewards more broadly beyond compensation, example of benefits, assimilation, relocation? And I know even Washington State has stuff in there about disclosure of benefits. So curious to what you're seeing across the jurisdictions in the EU.
Yeah. So the EU directive takes an incredibly broad definition of remuneration. It indicates that it's any pay or complementary or variable component. So anything that is considered to be remuneration within the jurisdiction, and the definitions as the examples that they provide includes benefits. Things like pensions, overtime, bonuses, allowances, etc. all fair game.
Got it. Okay, California question. The question says, in California, we're already required to provide pay ranges via job postings and team members upon request. The question is around, Christine, you mentioned expanding on right to information. What could that look like in California if they were to adopt that?
Yeah, how would that happen? So right now we're required to share the range for the role. So the pay range for the role. And often that's based on market data. The way that the right to information differs from that is that you have to provide actuals. So the actual average pay of men and the actual average pay of women in those same grouping categories. So for the EU directive, it's within the same category of work or within the same work of equal value. In the Michigan law, it's narrower than that. But that's the idea, is that you would have to provide actual average pay of men, average pay of women. So instead of being market-based, it's actually kind of internal pay. So if that catches on, and if it passes in Michigan, oftentimes what happens is that California does not like to be last on or behind on anything. And so often we see this kind of ping-ponging that happens across the coast as they follow suit. So that's why I think keeping your eyes on that Michigan one is a really good idea, because if that goes somewhere, then you can really expect that we're going to see it elsewhere, just like we saw with Colorado with the pay scale transparency law.
Okay, I'm going to read one more. Do folks expect scrutiny? This is for both of you. Do you expect scrutiny on pay equity disclosure? For example, if a company publishes something about a gender or race wage gap, will that become more risky from a litigation perspective?
I think so. And I think that sort of ties into the recommendation I have to get ahead of things by having an audit, because once you have that information out there, I think that it really opens you up to certain claims. And, there's private right of action, class and collective actions under the federal and the state laws. So you want to be mindful of that. And, that information can be used, by plaintiffs or plaintiffs' attorneys to try to recoup unpaid wages, and it could be very expensive. So that's why you want to make sure you have your house in order before you've got to disclose all that information more publicly.
Thanks, Sarah. Last thing, how should companies be preparing for this? Maybe each of you can take a stab at answering this in the 30 seconds to a minute that we have left. So Christine, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would really be focused on what are you doing in terms of posting jobs. I think that that's something that we're going to continue to see, that kind of opportunity transparency. With that, I think it really requires that you get really proactive about how you pay people and how you promote people within your organization. So a lot of the success that we've seen is employers using things like Syndio has a tool called Payfinder that allows you to identify what is that market range, and then also that equitable range. So that goes to that question that we got earlier, which is like, how does the right to information differ from the pay transparency laws? And really that puts both of those things together in the hands of employers so that they can make good decisions. We're also seeing continued centralization of your pay reporting as this landscape gets really, really complex. And we suspect that it's going to continue to get really complex at the state level, because as Sarah indicated, when there's less action at the federal level, often more action at the state level, which means that there's more focus. And so we're seeing a lot of employers using Syndio's global pay reporting functionality to centralize their reporting functionality around that.
And I would just add that, I think it's really important at the, the employer level to really make sure the people who are making compensation decisions and who are involved in hiring have the appropriate training and background, because the landscape keeps changing. There's lots of requirements. There's federal laws, there's state laws, and you want to make sure that whoever is making, putting out the job posts, putting the salary ranges on there, whoever is determining initial pay, determining, raises for some individuals and not giving other individuals raises, you want to make sure that all those people have the appropriate training and understanding of what they're doing, so that in making those changes, they're not running afoul of any equal pay laws. And the thing is, to be, found liable under these laws, you don't need to have any intent to discriminate. So it's not necessarily that you intended to pay, a woman less than a man who's doing substantially similar work. It's just that it happens that can put you on the hook. So it's really important that the people who are involved in these decisions, whether it's the hiring managers, HR professionals, people in your comp department, whoever it is, you want to make sure that they know what they're doing and that there's oversight over the process.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple more questions coming in, but we are at noon. So I'm going to close this off with a big thank you, Sarah and Christine. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your insights. Really appreciate it. I think the number of questions coming in is just a sign that people are hungry to learn more about what experts think is around the corner. And I think you did a great job sort of previewing that for everyone with a lot of specificity. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.